terms of computers, for a ton of sugar in China used to be you got 10 computers for every ton of sugar, and in Brazil it was 1 for 1. Now, once the countries are trading with one another, the prices are going to have to be the same in the two countries. So now it might be, say, 5 computers for a ton of sugar. And what that means is that the Chinese farmer, who used to get for every ton of sugar she produced, 10 computers, is now only getting 5. So her price has been cut in half. On the other hand, the Brazilian factory owner, who used to get 1 computer for every ton of sugar, now only gets 1/5 of a computer for every ton of sugar, right? And so her price has fallen 5 times. So what that means is that the Brazilian farmers and the Chinese producers are much better off, much more better off than the Brazilian factory owners are worse off, and the Chinese farm owners are worse off. But the people who are relatively scarce, because there weren't so many sugar fields in China, or they weren't so productive, and there weren't so many factories in Brazil, or they weren't so productive, are worse off as a result of trade. The people who the country ends up producing less of after there's trade are worse off as a result of trade. This is called the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. And economists usually say that the solution to this is pretty simple. You should just tax the people who benefited from trade, the Chinese computer manufacturers or the Brazilian farmers, and redistribute to the people who were hurt by trade, and then everyone will be better off. But in practice, this can be very hard because if we are constantly giving money to anyone who gets hurt by trade, it gives people an incentive to look like they're the people who get hurt by trade, right? So people will lobby for protectionism against their industry so that when the protectionism gets removed, they then get compensated for that, right? And so even while in theory it would be very good to compensate people, it can have these perverse incentives that it gives people an incentive to try to game the system, basically. And this can make it very difficult to avoid a system where some people get hurt by trade and therefore are opposed to trade, which makes society better off. So in the US, the classic example of this is that labor in the United States is quite scarce compared to in most developing countries. And therefore, labor unions in the United States tend to be the big supporters of protectionism because they don't want to face competition from abroad. And these theories have also been used to explain the politics of many countries historically. So in the United Kingdom during the 19th century, labor and capital were both quite abundant. Because England is a very small country, and there were a lot of people, and there was also a lot of capital because they were very good at developing machines and so forth. And so the laborers and the capitalists had a sort of an alliance in what was called the Liberal Party to support free trade and to support openness to the world, and that led to sort of a very positive politics in the UK. On the other hand, in Germany, both land and capital were very scarce, but there were a ton of people. So labor was abundant, but land and capital were both scarce, and so land and capital formed an alliance to try to oppose trade and openness, and labor formed had a group. And so rather than having sort of the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, you ended up with the fascists, who represented capital and land, and with the communists, who represented the workers, and so you had a very big conflict. So there's been efforts to use the Stolper-Samuelson theory to think about why different coalitions form politically in different countries, and explain things like, why the politics of Britain was so sort of positive, and why the politics of Germany was so poisonous. So the story we've been telling so far was one where, there are some things that China is just inherently and naturally good at, and there's some things that Brazil was inherently and naturally good at. But, and I think that's important in many cases. So a classic example of that is the broader trade between China and Latin America. In recent years, China has been exporting lots of, textiles and manufactured goods to Latin America in exchange, and to Africa, in exchange for a lot of raw materials, like things coming out of mines, ores, agricultural goods, and so forth. Another example of that is the trade between the United States and Latin America. So lots of Latin American countries, especially Peru and Chile, produce like asparagus and other yuppie vegetables from the United States in exchange for what the United States produces, which is crappy fast food and some types of technology and Lady Gaga. However, many of the most important gains from trade don't come out of sort of natural things that different countries are good at, but just what they end up deciding to specialize in. So this is called the Krugman Model, and a classic example of this is, most hardware is produced in Japan, or is created by Japanese engineers. But most software is made in the United States. Why is that? I mean, it's not obvious that Japan is naturally better at making hardware and the US is naturally better at making software. It's just that, for a variety of reasons, Japan ended up specializing in hardware, and people got really expert in that, and therefore other people in Japan were able to learn how to do it, and they sort of all reinforced one another. And in the US, people sort of specialized in software, and people got really good at that, and there was a good software programming culture, and everyone learned based on that. And so it wasn't really that there was a comparative advantage of any given country. It's just that that's what they chose to specialize in. And in fact, you do that in your lives too. I mean, you're probably better at some things than another. But the main reason why you'll end up being a good investment banker or a good lawyer or a good doctor is because you learn how to be good at those. You choose to specialize in that, not because you're sort of naturally a doctor or a lawyer or anything else, right? And Adam Smith wrote about this in the story of his pin factory. He said that, in the pin factory, different people do different tasks. And everyone specializes in one thing and gets really good at it. It's not that someone's inherently good at like slicing the line and another person is inherently good at polishing it. It's just that they each, over time, specialize in one thing and everyone benefits from that, from the division of labor. And that happens across countries. And often it benefits a country a lot to sort of focus on certain things to get really good at so that they have a comparative advantage, so that they have something to add to the world market. Another reason why international trade can be beneficial is just that there are some people who are sort of exceptionally talented in each country. Not necessarily that that country is overall good at that thing or naturally good at it, but just that it's really beneficial to everyone to benefit from the geniuses everywhere. So it's not true that the US is typically better than Japan or Korea at making cell phones, right? In fact, quite the opposite. But Steve Jobs happened to be this amazing guy, and so he was able to send all the iPhones to Taiwan and Japan. And on the other hand, all the brilliant televisions that were made by Motorola, by Samsung, were created in Korea, and then were exported. Samsung's Korean, right? Not Japanese, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. And then are exported to the United States. And it really doesn't come from that one country is inherently better than the other at something. It's just that there were some exceptionally talented people, and because of trade, everyone in the world was able to benefit from those. So there's many other logics to trade that are like this, but not everything is just narrowly based on inherently one country is sort of overall better at one thing and another country is overall better at another. There's lots of different reasons why there can be benefits to countries specializing or to certain people in the countries reaching people in other countries. Okay, so now I want to talk about comparative statics of equilibrium. And imagine that we increase the supply of a good in a market. We should expect that the price is going to fall of that good, right? And for normal supply and demand curves, that's exactly what you get. But I want to think a little bit more in detail about that now. So let's just do this mathematically. Let's imagine that there's just some supply added to the market. Equilibrium in the market is that supply is equal to demand. So if we increase supply by a little amount S, that's going to mean that now supply plus S is equal to demand, right? And how much does that change price? Well, we can just use the implicit function theorem, right? How do we do that? Well, we take the derivative of both sides of this, right? So we get that 1 plus S prime times dP ds is equal to d prime times dP ds, right? And then we can put these both on the same side, divide through, and we get that dP ds is equal to d prime minus S prime. So we thought this was going to be negative, right? If you increase the supply, the price should go down. And that's exactly what we find, right? Because the supply-demand curve goes down, and the supply curve goes up, so this whole thing down there is negative, and we get this is negative, right? Okay, so this is just the classic formula for the effect of an increase in supply, and it comes out of the fact that demand slopes downward and supply slopes upward, that things go in the right direction. But what if instead demand didn't slope downward or supply didn't slope upward? What would happen? Well, one thing that would happen is that the equilibrium wouldn't be very stable. It wouldn't really be much of an equilibrium at all. So imagine that that's instead of demand sloping downward and supply sloping upward, demand sloped upward and supply sloped downward, right? Then, if we were to raise the price a little bit above equilibrium, there would be more demand and less supply at a higher price. But when there's more demand and less supply, there's going to be more people chasing after fewer goods, and that's going to raise the price more, right? And then that would lead to even more demand and less supply, and so forth, right? And so there would be continuously, the price would rise. If the price went a little bit below equilibrium, it would keep falling. And so that equilibrium wouldn't be stable, it would be unstable. And in fact, you'll explore this in your problem set a bit more. So now what that indicates is that it's not actually crucial that demand literally slopes downward and supply literally slopes upward. The key thing is that demand doesn't slope upward more quickly than supply slopes upward, or that demand doesn't slope downward, supply doesn't slope downward more quickly than demand slopes downward. So that the difference between these two things is still negative, right? So that says demand and supply have to cut each other in the right direction. It doesn't really matter so much that both of them are sloping in the right direction. The key thing is that this derivative of the difference between demand and supply has to be negative. Now, when there's more than one product, the math gets uglier, and I won't show that to you. But there are notions of having a negative derivative, which you can extend to multiple products, things about like negative definiteness of a matrix and so forth. But the key thing to remember is you're going to get completely crazy answers if you add an equilibrium that's actually unstable. So if you have some equilibrium, but the demand and the supply curve are going in the wrong direction, if you try to do anything, you're going to get completely the wrong conclusion. That if you increase supply, then quantity, then the price would increase. So it's very important